Royal Guard. Still unblinking until that day, he broke a tradition everyone thought was unbreakable. Not because of pressure, not because of cameras, but because that man was a veteran. One of the millions who had sacrificed quietly, the ones the news had long forgotten, but whose veteran stories never disappeared. And in that moment, among hundreds of tourists at Buckingham Palace, a young guard bowed his head. For a truth no one dared deny. You're watching justice for veterans. And this is the story that made an entire crowd fall silent. Voice over: Frank Delanidy, 5 years old, a Royal Navy veteran. That day, he didn't come to Buckingham Palace as a tourist, but as someone returning. He wore his old uniform, faded, a few loose buttons. On his chest, a row of silver medals, each one a memory he never spoke of. Beside him was Ethan, his 12-year-old grandson, hair golden, eyes full of wonder. "Grandpa, are they real soldiers?" Ethan asked, pointing at the motionless guards. Frank smiled softly. "More real than anyone you'll ever meet." And then he walked slowly toward one young guard, as if trying to recover something long lost. But Ethan didn't know. In a few seconds, he'd witnessed something no textbook could teach. Chow's voice over. Frank stopped, about 3 paces from the guard. The crowd around him kept laughing, taking photos. Only he stood still. He raised his hand, slowly, in a military salute. No one noticed. But Ethan, standing behind, felt something was different. His grandfather's hand trembled slightly, but his gaze remained fixed, focused on the young guard. The god unmoving. Eyes forward. No blink. Frank held the salute. 3 seconds. 5. 10 passed. Some people nearby began to quiet down, turning to look. Ethan whispered, "Grandpa, why aren't you putting your hand down?" Frank didn't answer, but someone could feel something shift in the air. "Yo," voiceover. Then, something no one believed possible happened. The guard, under countless eyes, moved slightly. Just the smallest motion, but for those who know royal protocol, it was unthinkable. His eyes no longer blank, but deep, aware. He understood. The man saluting him wasn't a tourist. He was a soldier, a brother, a witness to war. And in that instant, the young guard, still in position, raised his hand and saluted. The crowd fell utterly silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Ethan clutched his grandfather's hand and whispered, "Grandpa." He saluted back. But Frank stood still, eyes glistening, because he knew what he just received was more than a salute. "Jen?" Voiceover. In the moment the 2 soldiers saluted one another, no words were spoken. Camera clicks stopped. Tourist smiles faded. A middle-aged woman pulled a tissue, wiping tears from her eyes. An older man, also wearing a veteran badge, stood in the crowd, quietly saluting. All eyes turned to Frank, but he saw none of it. He only saw familiar faces from decades ago, comrades who never came home. Ethan held his grandfather's hand tighter. Frank gave a soft nod, like finishing a sacred ritual. A gentle breeze passed. The flag atop Buckingham Palace fluttered, as if bowing. And in that moment, the space became an unplanned memorial, and no one was a tourist anymore. They were witnesses to something too real to forget. Yacht voiceover. When the guard returned to stillness, Frank gently lowered his hand. Ethan stared at him, still trying to understand what just happened. He reached out to touch the medals on Frank's chest. "Grandpa, did they salute you like that back then?" Frank smiled faintly, but tears welled up. He didn't answer immediately. After a long pause, he whispered, "No, son. Back then, we only saluted those who never came home." Ethan froze. That answer sent chills down his spine, even under the sun. His grandfather's salute wasn't a formality. It was a farewell to those who fell in silence. And today, For the first time, someone living saluted back. That had never happened before. G voiceover. Frank turned to his grandson. His eyes, dimmed by time, suddenly held something. Not pride, but the lifting of an invisible burden. "I've saluted many times like that," he said quietly. "But no one's ever saluted back." Ethan looked up, not fully understanding, but feeling the weight of those words. To Frank, every salute was a goodbye. On the deck, in base camps, on smoke-filled runways, and today, for the first time in decades, a living soul returned the honor. No medals needed, no ceremony, just an understanding look. A salute returned. Frank wasn't alone, at least today. He was remembered not as an old man, but as a soldier. Huge voiceover. No one knew. Behind that unmoving face, the young guard was struggling. He'd been trained to follow protocol. Stand still. No movement, no reaction, no emotion. But when his eyes met the elderly man wearing that worn uniform, he realized something. He had read about it, studied past wars, but this was living history standing before him. A real soldier, weathered, wounded, surviving. Inside, orders screamed, "Do not break formation." But in his heart, something stronger than duty stirred, respect. And with one salute, he knew he broke the rule. But in return, he did the most honorable thing of his military life. One look, one gesture, a bridge between generations, built in silence. Gone. Voiceover. At first, the crowd just watched. They laughed, took photos, waited for the changing of the guard, like every other day. But now, silence. A young man removed his hat, placed a hand over his heart. A foreign tourist wiped his lens, but didn't keep filming. No one needed to be told, but everyone felt it. They were witnessing something not on any tour brochure. A middle-aged woman whispered to her son, "Remember this moment. This is truth, not theater." In that moment, Buckingham Palace was no longer a tourist site, but a living memorial. No nameplate, no fanfare, but full of spirit. And somewhere, quietly, a lone round of applause began. At first solitary, then spreading, like a shared heartbeat awakening. Voiceover. Frank slowly turned away. He said nothing. He didn't look back. He walked between two lines of people. No one directed them, but everyone moved aside. Ethan walked beside him, still watching the guard. "Grandpa, aren't you going to say anything to him?" he whispered. Frank shook his head. Between soldiers, no words are needed. A small child, holding his mother's hand, gave a soft wave as Frank passed. An old man, leaning on a cane, stood a bit straighter, and in those few short seconds, an old veteran, thought forgotten by history, made an entire generation bow their heads. The palace stood unchanged. The guard returned to his stance, but to everyone there, something had shifted forever. Huge voiceover. Ethan and Frank walked away from the palace gates. Outside, the street was still busy. Life moved on. But inside Ethan's mind, everything felt paused. "Grandpa," his voice now softer, no longer just curious. "Back then, were you afraid?" Frank smiled, eyes gazing into the distance. "Of course, but when you stand beside people you trust, the fear becomes smaller." Ethan looked down. After a moment, he asked, "Do you remember their names?" Frank stopped. Everyone, every voice, every face. They strolled along the pavement. Frank looked up at the pale sky, then quietly said, "And today, for the first time, I feel like I brought them back, even just a little." Ethan said nothing, but for the first time, he gripped his grandfather's hand tighter than ever. He gave voiceover. On their way home, Frank stopped by a small park near the palace. There stood a silent stone monument, unnoticed by most. But to him, it was a roofless temple for those without names. He removed his navy cap, placed it over his chest. Ethan stood a few steps away, not daring to speak. Frank closed his eyes. In his mind, old images returned. Wet ship decks, alarm sirens, comrades' final glances. The breeze brushed against the ribbons on his chest, as if someone unseen had just passed by. He whispered something so softly. It might have been a name. It might have been, "I'm sorry." Or just, "Thank you." Then he laid his hand on the cold stone. A simple gesture, but one that carried the weight of a lifetime of silence. Jay voiceover. Ethan watched him unblinking. Then suddenly he took off his sports jacket, which had the American flag printed on the back, and gently laid it beside Frank's Navy cap at the base of the monument. Frank turned, surprised. "What are you doing?" Ethan took a breath, voice trembling a little. "I don't have medals. I've never been to war, but if you still remember them, then I'll remember you too." Frank said nothing. The wind swept through, lifting the jacket's hem and Ethan's hair, as if someone gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Frank placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder. No words, but it was the most sacred acknowledgement a soldier could give. At the monument, 2 caps and a jacket bearing the flag. The old generation didn't vanish. It was just passed on. Yay, voiceover. Frank and Ethan sat together on an old stone bench, in front of them 2 caps still resting side by side at the base of the monument. The sky began to change. The afternoon sun poured through old branches like a curtain of time. Frank spoke, voice low but firm. "You know, son, honor isn't in the uniform. It's not in the medals. It's in remembering someone for what they did for others." Ethan nodded. His eyes welled up, but no tears fell. "I'll remember. Not because you're a veteran, but because you taught me what respect truly means." Frank smiled the softest, yet most sincere smile of his entire service. Because he knew, memory doesn't fade, someone's willing to carry it forward. You would voice over. Not everyone who wore a uniform gets their name in the history books. Not every salute is returned. But that day, a royal guard broke the rules, not because of orders, but because of a truth no one dares forget. Some people spend their lives keeping the flag steady. Yet when they return, society looks away as if they were never seen. Frank didn't need fanfare. He needed recognition from the living generation, for the ones who gave everything. And today, he received it. Not from the government, not through ceremony, but from a young soldier's eyes, and a grandson who didn't yet understand war. Because justice isn't just verdicts. It's when history is called by its rightful name. This is justice for veterans. If you still remember someone like Frank, leave a ha, or simply write, "I still remember."